What if everything you believed about love, trust, and destiny was wrong? Khalid had it all. Money, power, an inherited empire. But deep down, he felt an emptiness that no fortune could fill. When he decided to defy his family and follow his own path, he believed he had found freedom. But what happens when freedom comes at too high a price? An unexpected love, a hidden secret, a betrayal that never existed, but almost destroyed everything. And in the end, a single question: would you have the courage to doubt the one person who really loved you? Khalid and Sarah's story isn't just about romance. It's about redemption, second chances, and a legacy that would change everything. But before we get to the end, you need to know how it all began. You can never run away from who you are, Khalid. His father's voice sounded like thunder in the vast office, where every piece of furniture was a reminder of the empire he was to inherit. Khalid felt the weight of the words, but for the first time he didn't back down. What if I don't want to be just an heir? He clenched his fists, staring at the man in front of him. Farid, an imposing tycoon, stood up slowly. His cold eyes analyzed his son as a risky investment. So tell me, what do you want to be? Khalid hesitated. He knew the answer, but had never dared to say it out loud. He wanted freedom. He wanted to know the world beyond the golden walls of the mansion, where every decision had already been made for him before he was even born. But none of that mattered to his father. You have a destiny mapped out, Farid continued, and that includes your engagement to Aisha. She is right for you. This marriage will unite our families and strengthen our empire. In the corner of the room, his mother, Samira, watched in silence. Her gaze was not one of compassion, but of resignation. I know what they expect of me, Khalid murmured, but there's a world beyond these walls, and I need to see it. The tension in the room became palpable. Farid narrowed his eyes. Do you want to throw away your legacy? I want to find out who I am without it. The silence was cutting. Then his father let out a cold laugh. Then go, Farid said, turning to the window. But remember, one day you'll have to come back, and when you do, you'll realize that you never stopped being an Al-Rashid. That evening, Khalid met Aisha in the garden. She was as elegant as ever, her delicate features hiding a restless soul. So it's true? She asked, her eyes shining in the moonlight. Yes, Khalid replied. I'm leaving. She sighed, but didn't seem surprised. Part of me always knew you wouldn't stay, she said softly. I just wish we'd had time to choose for ourselves. Khalid bowed his head. If I could change that, I would. Aisha smiled, but it was a sad smile. If anything happens to me, I want you to live your life as you wish. He frowned. What do you mean? Nothing, she shook her head. Just promise you'll never regret following your heart. The next morning, with his suitcase packed, Khalid looked back one last time before boarding the plane. His mother didn't say goodbye, neither did his father. He was free, but freedom carried a weight that he would only understand later. The cold wind blew against Khalid's face as he stepped off the plane. The city in front of him pulsed with an energy unlike anything he had ever known. The signs glowed in neon, and the streets were dominated by a cacophony of cars and voices. Far from the marble palaces and lavish dinners, he felt, for the first time, that his life belonged to him alone. In the first month, Khalid faced difficulties he had never imagined. He swapped his tailored clothes for ordinary ones and learned to cook his own food. University classes were intense, and the money seemed to evaporate before the end of each week. Once, he spent 2 days eating only bread and water. Each small victory, however, tasted indescribable. He was amazed at the pleasure of simple things, like walking down the street without being recognized. You're not like the others, commented Liam, his roommate, during a study night. He watched him curiously. You work as if you had something to prove. Maybe I do, replied Khalid, without giving any more details. He preferred no one to know who he was or where he came from. Time passed, and Khalid adapted to the new routine. He immersed himself in books, studying until dawn, and working during the day. Then a devastating blow hit him. The phone rang in the middle of the night. He answered it, still groggy from sleep. "Aisha was on flight 217, said the voice on the other end. It was his cousin. "What do you mean?" he mumbled, still confused. "The plane crashed in the Atlantic. There were no survivors. The world spun." He remained silent, trying to absorb those words. His fingers trembled as he held the phone. For a moment, he thought it was a nightmare, but the voice on the other end left no doubt. She's gone," he muttered at last. He hung up the phone and fell into bed, but sleep never came. Aisha's words echoed in his mind like a curse. "Promise yourself that you will never regret following your heart." Over the next few days, Khalid wandered the streets like a lost soul. He questioned everything, from his choices to his own worth. How could he live knowing that he would never have the chance to say goodbye to her? Regret ate away at his soul, but he also knew that Aisha wouldn't have accepted seeing him like this. "You have to pick yourself up," he muttered to himself, looking at his tired reflection in the bathroom mirror. "There's no other choice." He buried his grief in his work and studies. Grief gave way to determination, and soon his name stood out at the university. He was hired before he even graduated, and his business began to flourish. Khalid kept his origins a secret, refusing invitations to luxury events or anything that might remind him of the past. Then, years later, the phone rang again. This time, it was his mother. "Your father is dying, Khalid," said Samira, her voice as cold as ever. "It's time to go home." He took a deep breath. He hadn't felt anything for that man in years, but he knew he couldn't ignore the call. There was no choice. "When?" he asked without emotion. "Now." He closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the memories returning like waves. Fighting the past was no longer an option. The plane landed smoothly on the runway, but inside Khalid, everything felt turbulent. He hadn't set foot in his homeland for years, and every step towards the airport exit felt like a dive into unknown waters. At the arrivals gate, Samira was waiting for him with the same impassive expression as always. Her gaze scanned her son from top to bottom, as if trying to assess what remained of the boy who had left years ago. "You've changed," she finally said. "Not you," replied Khalid, picking up his suitcase and walking towards the car that was waiting for him. On the way to the family mansion, the city flashed before his eyes like a blur of memories. The buildings were taller, the streets more crowded, but the feeling of oppression was the same. "The doctor says he doesn't have much time." Samira broke the silence. "You need to see him before it's too late. Would he mind if I didn't go?" She sighed, but didn't answer. Deep down, Khalid already knew the answer. The mansion seemed untouched by time. Every golden detail and cold marble was exactly as he remembered it, as if his absence had never been felt. When he entered his father's room, he found a man very different from the titan who had once challenged him. Farid lay there, frail, his pale skin contrasting with the white sheet. "So you came." His voice was a whisper, but it carried the same firmness as before. "I didn't think I had a choice," Khalid replied, taking a seat on the side of the bed. "You never did." Farid coughed, breathing hard. "But now, you need to understand that this family needs you." Khalid watched the man who had shaped his life with rigid rules and broken hopes. He should feel something. Anger, sadness, relief. But there was only a nagging emptiness. "I didn't come to discuss business," he finally said. "Then what did you come for?" "To say goodbye." Farid smiled bitterly. "You think running away made you a free man, but you've always carried that name with you." Khalid clenched his fists, but remained silent. 3 days later, his father passed away. The news spread quickly, and soon the house was full of businessmen and influential figures, all watching Khalid expectantly. He knew what they wanted: a strong successor, someone who would keep the empire intact. Amid the speeches and condolences, he felt the appraising glances. They knew he wasn't like his father. They knew he could change everything. It was during one of these receptions that he saw her for the first time. Sarah was at the edge of the room, holding a tray of drinks. Her dark hair fell over her shoulders, and her eyes had a softness that was at odds with the ostentation around her. "Sir, would you like something to drink?" she asked politely. Khalid hesitated for a second, not because he wanted a drink, but because, for some reason, he didn't want the moment to end. "Yes," he replied, taking the glass from her hand. Their fingers touched for a moment, and Khalid realized something different. For years, he had been surrounded by people who treated him like a prince, a future tycoon, someone they needed to please. But in Sarah's eyes, he didn't see flattery. He saw curiosity, and for the first time since his return, he felt that something new was about to begin. Over the next few days, Khalid realized that he couldn't get Sarah out of his mind. It wasn't just her discreet beauty or her attentive gaze. There was something about her that seemed different from everything he knew. He watched her discreetly at the mansion's events, always efficient, always professional. But there were times when she laughed quietly with other employees, and that sound seemed to echo from a place more real than anything around her. That evening, after a stressful meeting about the future of the company, he found her in the garden. "I could ask you what you're doing here," he said, leaning against a pillar. She looked up in surprise. "I like silence," she replied simply. Khalid smiled sideways. "Then you've chosen the worst place to work." Sarah let out a restrained laugh. "Yeah, I get it." There was a comfortable silence between the two of them. The wind lightly rustled the leaves on the trees, and for the first time in weeks, Khalid felt like he could breathe. "You don't look like the people here," he said, watching her. "Maybe because I'm not one of them." She looked at him defiantly. It intrigued him. "And who are you?" "Someone who doesn't have time for rich people's games." Khalid laughed, surprised by the direct answer. For the first time in a long time, someone was talking to him bluntly. Over the next week, he made a point of spending more time where he knew he could find her. Small talk turned into long conversations, and before long, the connection between them was undeniable. It was only after a month that he decided to act. "I want to take you to dinner," he said one evening after an event. Sarah arched her eyebrows. "Is that an invitation or an order?" "An invitation," she replied, smiling. "But I won't take no for an answer." She sighed, crossing her arms. "Aren't you afraid of what they'll say?" "I've never cared what anyone says." Sarah looked at him for a moment. Then she shook her head with a small smile. "Fine, but if it's a restaurant full of people in suits worth thousands of dollars, I'll leave." Khalid laughed. "I promise it won't be." Dinner took place in a small restaurant off the beaten track. Khalid discovered that Sarah had an easy laugh and sharp opinions. He found himself telling her about university, about running away from the mansion to find freedom. "So you ran away, but ended up back in the same place?" The question hung in the air. "Maybe," he replied, "but not everything has to be the same." The following weeks were marked by hidden meetings, late-night conversations, and a feeling Khalid hadn't felt for years: excitement. He wanted to know every part of her. He wanted to discover her dreams. He wanted her to know that someone really saw her. So one night under a starry sky, he made the request. "I want to be with you. For real." Sarah hesitated. "Do you know what you're saying?" "I do, and I don't care what anyone thinks." She watched him for a long moment. Then she smiled. "So I guess you're stuck with me now." Little did they know that this was only the beginning of the storm to come. The announcement of Khalid and Sarah's engagement dropped like a bombshell in high society. The whispers began discreetly, but soon turned into open declarations of indignation. "He's gone mad," some said. "She just wants his money," said others. In the mansion, Samira barely looked at her son. When she finally spoke, her voice was icy. "You're throwing away everything your father built." Khalid took a deep breath. "I'm building something of my own. With a woman who doesn't belong in our world. She belongs to mine." The conversation ended with Samira leaving the room without looking back. But her words stayed in Khalid's mind, and as the rumors grew, a seed of doubt began to grow. One evening, Youssef, the family chauffeur, approached him hesitantly. "Sir, there's something you need to know about your wife." Khalid frowned. "What is it?" "She's been going out alone, always to the same place." His stomach churned. "And where would that be?" "A small house outside the city, always at the same time every week." Khalid's heart raced. He had never questioned Sarah before. He'd never had to. But what if everyone was right? What if he was just a fool in love? The next morning, he disguised himself and took Youssef's place behind the wheel. When Sarah got into the car, she didn't notice anything. Khalid drove in silence, watching her through the rearview mirror. She seemed calm, with no idea of the turmoil going on inside him. The road led to a part of town that Khalid didn't frequent. Narrow streets, worn-out buildings, a reality far removed from the opulence in which he had grown up. Then Sarah got out of the car and entered a simple house with peeling walls. Khalid waited a few minutes, then got out and approached slowly. Inside, there were voices. He held his breath. "Are you eating properly?" It was Sarah's voice. "Don't worry about me, child." Khalid's eyes widened. The blood was pounding in his ears as he looked out of the window. Inside, Sarah was hugging a frail, white-haired old man, holding his hands lovingly. "I wanted to tell you," she said, her voice breaking, "but I was afraid." Khalid's chest tightened. He walked away from the house, the weight of regret falling on his shoulders. That evening, when Sarah returned, she found Khalid sitting in the study, his gaze fixed on a distant point. "Do you want to tell me something?" he asked, his voice low. She hesitated for a second, then sighed. "Yes." She sat down in front of him and intertwined her fingers. "This man I'm visiting, he's my father." The silence stretched on. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" "Because I knew no one would accept it. I was afraid of being treated differently. Afraid that you would see my origin as a problem." Khalid closed his eyes. He had doubted her. He had hurt her without even confronting her. "I'm an idiot," he muttered. Sarah smiled, but her eyes were sad. "Yes, but there's still time to fix it." It was then that she said something that would change everything. "There's something else I need to tell you, Khalid." He looked up, feeling his heart race. "I'm pregnant." For a moment, Khalid was still. The silence between him and Sarah seemed like an eternity. "Pregnant." The word came out as a whisper. She nodded, her eyes shining, but there was a contained fear there. Fear of his reaction. Khalid took a deep breath. In the midst of all the doubts he had felt, in the midst of the storm of mistrust that had almost led him to lose Sarah, this news hit him like a bolt of lightning. There was no more room for hesitation. He moved closer and took her hands between his. "I was a fool," he said sincerely, "and I don't want to be a fool to our son." Sarah closed her eyes and smiled, relieved. The following months brought unexpected changes. The news of the baby eased tensions in the house. Samira, although still cold toward Sarah, seemed shaken by the arrival of her grandson. Little by little, her resistance began to crumble. When the baby was born, Khalid saw his mother hold the child in her arms for the first time. "He has your eyes," she said, her voice softer than he had ever heard it. It was at that moment that he realized something was changing. The baby's presence brought the two families closer together. Sarah's father was brought to the mansion and, little by little, the distance between their origins dissolved. But Khalid knew he still needed to do more. He didn't want his son to grow up in a world where origin defined value. He wanted to create something new, a real legacy. That's when the idea came to him. "What if we created a place where everyone had equal opportunities?" he said to Sarah one evening. She frowned. "What do you mean?" "A city, a place where tradition and innovation coexist, where people have access to education, housing, and real opportunities. That's a dream, Khalid. Then let's make it real." The following years were dedicated to building this legacy. The family empire changed completely. He invested in renewable energy, social programs, and above all the creation of Nur City, a place where progress was not reserved for the privileged few. And when the city finally came to life, Sarah was by his side, holding her son's hand. "We did it," he said. She smiled. "No, you did it." Khalid looked around, seeing the streets lit up, the children running free, the people living without fear of judgment. He knew that true success didn't lie in wealth or power. It was in that. In family, in love, and in everything he had built alongside the woman he had almost lost because of his own insecurity. Now, looking at his wife and the future, he knew they had won.